So there's things that we do to structure it so a screen reader can read it properly. Well, actually, when we design that way, it becomes inclusive for everybody.
Welcome to Talk Learning with me. I'm Joseph Diaz, an instructional designer passionate about connecting with others and exploring the field of learning and development. In this podcast, we dive into topics like education, learning science, facilitation, behavior change, and other skills related to personal and professional growth. If you're looking to connect with other lifelong learners and discover new insights from talented learning professionals, this show is for you. I've been looking forward to sharing this episode since we first recorded in January, and I'm thrilled to finally bring it to you. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Nicole L'Etoile, a dedicated learning experience designer and passionate advocate for accessibility. Nicole specializes in creating accessible and inclusive courses that drive impactful learning experiences. And if this conversation sparks your interest in accessibility, Nicole's Making Online Content Accessible for All course is the perfect next step. The next cohort starts April 7th, and it's a great way to deepen your skills in making learning experiences truly inclusive. I'll include the registration link in the show notes so you can check it out. In this conversation, we'll explore practical ways to apply accessibility guidelines, the importance of plain language, and some tools you can use to make your content more accessible for all learners. On that note, let's talk accessibility. Hey there, Nicole. Welcome to Talk Learning with me. It's great to see you.
Hey, good to see you too. Really
How are you
excited.
doing today?
I'm doing well. Yeah, how are you?
You know, I'm doing great. We're close to the weekend, so really excited. Had a lot of really good experiences at work lately, and I think 2025 has been kicking off bright. How about yourself?
Yeah, it's been great. It's been busy, and I'm not going to complain because busy is good, but it's been busy. I just, when you said it's 2025, I had to look up at the calendar and go, how far into it are we? Oh, it's okay. It's January 17th. Okay, good.
Yeah, I love that. And I have to agree. Sometimes busy is just the first word that comes to mind when someone says, how are you doing? And I have to remind myself, busy is good. I'm busy with good things, and that keeps me happy. But before I get too derailed, Nicole, for those who are meeting you for the first time, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself and maybe your background on accessibility?
Yeah, of course. So the title that I'm using today, let's just think of that. Like, what title am I going by? Some days I'm a business owner. Some days I'm a consultant. Sometimes I'm a freelancer, but I'm a learning experience designer. I guess if we summarize the whole thing, who focuses in on accessibility and accessibility consultant and professional. And the background, it's just really being focused on how do I make digital content and digital experiences, learning accessible for everyone. And that's been the focus.
Wow, that's really cool. And what is it about your career that led you to this specific focus in accessibility? Were there any experiences in particular that stood out that made you really want to hone in so much on making experiences accessible to other people?
Yeah, and I had a conversation earlier this morning. I had a coffee chat with someone that I met on LinkedIn who has a passion for accessibility as well, coming from the university. She's at ASU. She's wonderful. And we were just chatting about what brought us to this. And I want to say something was revealed to me even this morning as I was saying it. Like, I think sometimes we'll say accessibility is a journey. And it really is a journey because you start out opening your eyes for one reason towards it, or opening your passion towards accessibility. And it could start from something you do for work. It could start with something personal. It could start with someone that you know. There's usually something that brings you into it. And then it starts out and it grows and it grows and it grows and it grows because it's really about human beings. And I think we start out with, I'm doing this because it's a job and it's part of my workload. And I started out with a very similar process that most people start out. I have a checklist. I have to review courses that I'm going to put out to the public. And I work with a team of instructional designers. As the LMS administrator, it's my job to review quality assurance, make sure that we check all those boxes. So it really starts out with that. And then as you learn more and dig into it, it's so much more. And we'll get into that. I don't want to reveal everything in this introduction, but yeah, for me, it started out as part of my job and it has grown into more of just the way I work in everything I do now, not just the tasks.
Yeah. And I love that you described that journey of starting out with maybe one experience in particular, whether that be in work or just personal experience. I know for myself, when I think accessibility, one of the things that always comes to mind quickly is visual accessibility. I wear glasses or contacts, and without them, I'm pretty much blind. And so I think visual accessibility is something that I'm constantly thinking about. And I actually was reminded of an experience as you were just talking. I remember I used to be a Spanish teacher, and I remember one time I was in the classroom with my students, and I was writing some different grammar principles on the whiteboard. And I noticed that one of the students was totally checked out. And I asked him, I said, "Hey, do you have any questions? Is there something that's confusing you?" And he said, "Well, I'm actually colorblind, and you're writing in a red marker on the whiteboard, so I can't see what you're writing." And that was probably one of my biggest initial exposures to accessibility, because he had been through about 4 weeks of class with me and had just never said anything about the fact that he couldn't see when I wrote in red marker. And I was so taken aback. I thought, oh my goodness, I can't imagine what an impact that had on his learning experience, that he couldn't see probably a good half of the things that I was writing on the board. So I love that you described that journey, that it's not like all of a sudden one day everything we create is accessible, but it really is this process of becoming more aware, being exposed to new guidelines and accessibility principles, and then incorporating them into our everyday work.
Yeah, and in your story, someone they shared it, they verbalized it to you, like so. Not everyone can do that or does that, so that's part of that journey. If someone shares it with you, you say, okay, now I know a little more, and then asking the questions or being able to be vulnerable and say, I don't know what I don't know, and then start asking even more questions. So maybe that opens up the door of, okay, I've been writing in red marker. What else have I been doing that might not be accessible for my students? So you start to kind of hone in and pay attention to that, because not everyone's comfortable talking about it or sharing it. So
Yeah.
those little things that people share with us are super helpful, and then that usually sends us on a, well, what else am I doing? What could I be doing better?
Yeah, that's a really important call out, that not everyone's going to be comfortable raising their hand and saying, this isn't working for me. This isn't accessible to me. And you make a great point. My student didn't say anything for almost a month until finally I asked him what's going on and he pointed it out. And so you described that you wear a ton of hats as a freelance worker, a contractor, learning experience designer. And I'm just curious, in the day-to-day work that you're doing as an LMS admin and reviewing content, what do you love or look forward to the most when it comes to your work in accessibility?
Yeah, I think there's so many layers to it. And right now, I'm not in a position of an LMS administrator. So when I come to the work, I'm designing. So if I freelance work, I design mostly at the university level as an instruction designer. And so I bake it into the design. So I know what I'm looking for. I know that I need to look for certain things before I start. Before I create the content, if I want interaction, I know that it has to be keyboard operated. I know that it has to be navigated a certain way. So I won't design it if it doesn't meet the criteria from the start. So, that's an approach, which I do enjoy, having the knowledge of the web accessibility guideline standards, and specifically knowing, am I looking at perceivable, operable, understandable, robust, the four principles that guide the work? I think of it as the framework to help us make things inclusive, to make us digital content inclusive. So if I have those and I know them, then I can design interactions accessible from the start. I can do color designing and make it perceivable from the start, things like that. And so that's one approach. When I maybe review, evaluate, or audit the work, having knowledge too of what should I start with? What's the barrier? What do I manually look for? And what can I automate into a test later on? But how do I communicate that in plain language? So I actually like the part where I have to take what I'm looking at from an instructional designer, look at their work. Maybe I'm reviewing and going to give feedback, and being able to break down the standard into plain language and say, this is what we need to know. And a lot of times when you're talking about e-learning and you're talking about instructional design and coursework, folks will say, well, I'm not a web designer. I'm not building a website, so I'm not sure how these apply to me. And I think I posted about this today on my LinkedIn page, was that it very much applies to you. Although you're working with a tool in the background, people are accessing your content through the web, right? It's going to
Right.
end up on the web at some point. it absolutely applies. Did I
Yeah,
answer the question? I don't know what.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think you almost read my mind there, as well as I was thinking about, you've mentioned these web accessibility guidelines, and well, why does that apply to creating learning experiences? And you mentioned kind of two aspects of your work that you love. Was you mentioned when you're the one creating the learning, this is something you've been so entrenched in that it's almost second nature. Instead of thinking about, okay, what are the web accessibility guidelines again? Let me go pull them up and look at what are the rules and guidelines. It's something that you're thinking about. Is this content navigable with just a keyboard? Is the visual contrast enough for somebody to see what I'm trying to share? And you're thinking about, is the audio actually clear enough that somebody could hear it if they weren't able to see the screen? And you're thinking about these things. It's second nature. But then the other side of the coin is also when you're doing those audits. And I can see why that would be so fulfilling, because it's almost the exact opposite. Instead of it being something so innate that you just do it without thinking about it, you can't just say, hey, I reviewed your content and you broke accessibility guideline number 3.2 and number 4.6. That's not going to really be meaningful feedback for other designers. So I love that you also mentioned, when you're doing those audits, you have to think about, how do I put this into plain language so that anybody could understand why this isn't accessible and what we need to change so that our target audience, our learners, can really interact with the content that we're putting out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so the guidelines, it's nice to know, like if you see a 1 at the start, I know I'm looking at something that's perceivable. It's nice to know if I see a 2 in front, I'm talking about operable. It goes in order. If I see a 3 in front of it, it's going to be understandable. If I see a 4, it's robust. So that kind of helps people, to think about it when you're like, well, if you see that language, what we're talking about are these things. And then to be able to have one-on-ones, like maybe you and I like would meet, and we could say, well, it's this guideline, it's this failure. This is what you can do. I take screenshots of what I'm looking at, and then there's always a recommendation that follows.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love that you're so in tune with those guidelines that just from seeing the number, you know exactly which section of the web accessibility guidelines the feedback is coming from, or the challenges, and you're able to quickly draw those lines. And I know that you've had a really huge accomplishment lately as well. You earned your CPA, CC, or CPAC certification. And so I thought that was really cool that you took the extra time to really dive in. And I know that a lot of people maybe don't have that expertise or that depth of knowledge that you have, having earned a certification. And so I'm curious, when you think about web accessibility guidelines, as a novice, someone who doesn't see that 1 and just thinks straight to the next line, what advice would you have for somebody who is thinking, I want to get more involved with making my content accessible, but I don't know where to start? There are so many guidelines. What is kind of a good way to kind of start off maybe in the kiddie pool before diving into the deep end and really being involved in every guideline?
Yeah. So back to the conversation around journey, I, started this journey 3 years ago. So, I would guess in the accessibility professional world, it's kind of like newbie, right? Like I'm on the newer side here. And
Yeah.
when I started out, it was, again, I would look at like, this is my checklist from WebAIM. I went through training from WebAIM, and they're out in Utah where you are, aren't they?
Hey,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
So they would kind of say, look for these things and start this. And so it starts there, and then it goes. But back to, I think the question around where do you start CPAC? Well, I'll go to CPAC first. So the core professional to get the certification as an accessibility professional. And the reason I wanted that was because it goes beyond the standards themselves, right? So it's not becoming an expert in every single standard. It is understanding, this is how I look at it. It's understanding the why behind the standard, and why we have the standards that we have. So you get to learn about the disability models, right? The frameworks that people approach the work. Am I coming to this from a social model? Is it a medical model? And maybe from the medical model, it's that person has a disability and it is up to figuring out a cure or to provide assistive technology and accommodation, versus a human, coming from a human model. Okay, so to get started, start exploring the WebAIM resources. Also want to start with the W3C website. Now, sometimes those the language of the W3C can get very jargon filled. So a suggestion I would make, if you have the time to do, is to take that. And if you're interested in using tools such as Google Notebook LM or any other AI tool, is put that in there and say, can you give me some of this information in plain language? I'm an instructional designer. I'm an L&D professional. What would I need to know and how would I apply these? So it would then give you some things that you might focus in on, right? And there are the basic things that you'd want to start with. So looking at the resources on WebAIM, looking at the W3C, following other professionals on LinkedIn who are providing little tips, and LinkedIn Learning has a bunch of free courses that you could get started with as an intro. I also share a resource. It's a curated list. It has some free and some paid. And those are some basic, if you want to do a 1 hour or 2 hour free course and just get the basics down, I'd recommend starting with those.
Very cool. Very cool. I love that you kind of mentioned also using AI in that way to kind of be your coach and say, I want to get into accessibility, and there's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of lingo in these guidelines. Help me understand how this applies to my role. I'm creating an instructor-led training. How does that apply? How do I make my content accessible? Or I'm creating an e-learning module in Articulate Storyline. What is the application for me with these web principles? It's not just web design. I don't have to just be a web developer to think about accessibility. So I thought that was a really cool application. And you mentioned your LinkedIn content. One of the posts that you shared recently that really stood out to me was you helped break down the jargon of plain text. What does that mean when we use plain text? And you mentioned a really cool tool, which was the Hemingway editor, taking content and putting it through the Hemingway editor and looking at the readability. Am I writing at the level of a fourth grader, a seventh grader, or is this language so robust that it's going to go over a lot of people's heads? And I thought that was such a manageable way to say, is my writing accessible? Am I putting out content that other people can understand, or am I getting so caught up in what I know and what I'm an expert in that I'm just talking at too high of a level for most people to understand? So I really love that there are tools out there and frameworks that we can use, like Hemingway, like ChatGPT, or Google Notebook LM that you mentioned, to say, help me take these accessibility guidelines and make them relevant to my work so that I can see, am I being accessible in my content creation?
Yeah, yeah. And I would kind of add to this a little bit too, because when we talk about it from instructional designers or content developers, we start to think about, well, how does it apply to my work? And I'm not a web designer, so does it really apply? And I know I should make things readable and understandable, but if you're ever finding that, it's not as gray, because there is a standard that says the content should be readable, it should be understandable. So there's an actual guideline that is being used under ADA laws or 508 laws and EAA, and there are laws that are using the guidelines to support this work. So many of us want our content to be readable. I think that's as professionals, right? That's
Yeah.
what we do in L&D. We want people to take in what we're saying, and we wanted to make it digestible. So we're going to use proper headings because we know that that's good formatting. We're going to use readability levels that we can provide the best approach. We could maybe give different formats. Maybe we want to give them the audio of the reading, or we want to use a brief of the reading. But really, there's a guideline that addresses that, and so you can say to it, it's not a nice to have. It's kind of, we have to do this. We should meet that guideline. So I think sometimes it's great to have tips and things. And a lot of questions people will ask when I do these talks is, how do you work with subject matter experts who are not as open, and how do you work with organizations that not everybody's on the same page? So that just made me
Yeah.
think of it, because it's easy to say, like, let's use this tool, let's do that. You and I are going to do that. Maybe some of the listeners are going to do that. But
And that's powerful that you said accessibility is not a nice to have. It's a must have. And I think that that's a mindset shift that maybe some of us haven't had yet, or are still working on too, is thinking about, I don't have time to go through and make the headings right, or I don't have the time to go through and put in this work. And so you mentioned being in a space where maybe it's not easy to focus on accessibility, whether that be because of tight deadlines, maybe the people you work with just don't seem to care, or maybe people feel overwhelmed by accessibility. How do you advocate for accessibility in spaces where maybe it's not a priority, when you come in and see that people aren't focused on it, or maybe you're just interacting with someone who isn't prioritizing accessibility? What have you found as an effective way to advocate for accessibility?
Yeah. And I want to first, there's like a first layer to that around, it was like a two-part question there. I heard two different things. So I want to make sure that I address the first part. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I love that you mentioned that accessibility isn't a nice to have, it's a must have. But you also pointed out the challenge that sometimes we find ourselves in different workplaces or settings where maybe it's not a priority. People don't care. They see it as a nice to have, not a must have. So
I
in those
remember.
settings, yeah, in those settings, how can we advocate for accessibility?
Okay. I remember what I wanted to say. This is what happens when you get to this, I was gonna say this age. Yeah, I'm gonna age myself out a bit. All right, so but I wanted to say about the time. That's what I wanted to say first. So I will address that doing accessibility right and doing it well will take more time. Once you know how much more time it'll take, the more you do it, you then start to figure out in the workflow, I know it's going to take me an additional 20, 30 minutes because I know that I'm not just going to add my captions, right? I know I have to have them. I'm going to add them, but that's not it. I'm not going to check a box. I'm going to edit my captions. And then from there, I'm going to make sure that the speaker has been identified in my captions. I'm also going to make sure the placements of my captions are correct, that they're only 2 lines on the bottom and that they don't take up, this much space and block important information on the video. The next thing I'm going to do is make sure the language is set correctly. So there's going to be a couple of extra things. I'm going to make sure that the transcript is included and edited. And if it's a really long transcript, I'll probably put some headings and some chapters. So that right there, what I just said, might take someone, right, to caption their video, upload their video, edit their captions and their transcripts. How much extra time would that take? What do you think?
Right. I
I'm
would say at least maybe 30 to 45 minutes if you were skilled at it. But I'm thinking first time going through, I've never done this. That's going to add at least another hour to my workflow personally.
Yeah. So in the mindset of someone who hasn't done that before and I'm on a time crunch and, I think, oh, I met compliance. I did my captions. I checked my box. Well, actually you haven't because you maybe you got level A, like you got your caption,
Right.
but you haven't even met the double standard, the 2 double A of captioning and adding that transcript. And then did you audio transcript? Did you add some descriptive language? Right. So, however, knowing that acknowledging it, I know when somebody on my team in the past has said, I don't have enough time and I just need to do the bare minimum so I can move on and get my other work done. Right. So the understanding that that's where someone's coming from, one, it's okay. So we need to model and give some tools to do this efficiently. Do I need a train? This back to our question. Do we need training on that?
Yeah.
Should we have an accessibility training? Because now we're just adding to the training. And then look at it from a lens. So let me give you an example of how to connect this all. I had a teammate who I worked with a couple of years ago who really felt like this was, I just want to do the basic, hit the compliant bare minimum, I want to move on. And would come back and say, we have 15,000 users, active users on the LMS. Can you tell me how many of those actually use a screen reader that I need to do this for? Take a deep breath, right? That's like, okay, how do I address this? So studying and understanding the CPAC is how I think I could approach this differently now, knowing what I know. Like I said, it's a journey. You could say there are 2.2 billion people in this world who have a visual impairment. I don't know of that number, how many folks use a screen reader. We don't have that data. But could you imagine how many people, and that visual impairment doesn't mean blind either. It could be low vision. It could be color blindness. There's categories and tasks, right? So could you imagine how many people maybe that we don't know about? We shouldn't be making that assumption. We're privileged enough to say that we don't need them, but we should not be making an assumption of which users need this or not use this. And it would be good for all of our users. So let's go ahead and do that. Having some knowledge, some factual statistic data. And so now I understand too why we studied that for the CPAC and knowing that so that we could help organizations and others kind of move and shift over a bit.
Yeah, that's really powerful to take those numbers and help give people that perspective so that when we're trying to advocate, instead of just saying, well, it's guideline 3.2, we have to do it, you can say this is how many people are affected by this accessibility guideline, and I want to account for those people. And I think it really also ties back to what we talked about earlier in our discussion when you said not everyone's going to speak up and say I have this disability. People aren't going to just, like you said in your example, there are 15,000 learners. How many actually use a screen reader? I can almost guarantee, even if there were 150 using a screen reader, they're not all going to email and say, hey, can we make sure that this course is accessible with a screen reader? Because that's just not human nature. We're not going to have everybody reaching out asking. And so we have to, as learning designers, we have to really be the ones that think about that and advocate for them. And then it's going to take vulnerability too on both sides to say, you know what, I don't understand how many people exactly need this accessibility, but I understand that it matters. So I'm going to take the extra 20 minutes to make sure that my captions are accurate and well timed. Or I'm going to take the extra time to go through and add headings and clear formatting to my post or my content so that it's easy to read and it's easy to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's good for everyone, right? So, it's so if I'm thinking about what is good for screen reader user and I'm thinking about HTML matters, right? That structure matters how I set it up. That okay, so I should have proper listing formatting. I should and that's because there's the way that the screen reader is reading the HTML, and so I won't go too technical. So there's things that we do to structure it so a screen reader can read it properly. Well, actually, when we design that way, we're designing it becomes inclusive for everybody. I like things nicely formatted. I
Right.
like to skim, I like to look at the headings, but beyond that, I like to know that I'm using H1 heading, not just making it bigger and bolder. Why do I need to know that? Because a screen reader navigator is going to navigate a page by heading levels. So if I use H1, H2, H3 versus I know I want a heading, so I'll just make that 32 font. I'll make it bold. That's great for visual, for someone who's a sighted can, that helps them, but it doesn't help the screen reader user.
Yeah. And that's a really great point that you make, that it benefits everybody when we create accessible content. So to answer your coworker's question, we have 15,000 people using this LMS. How many people need this accessibility? You can almost turn that on its head and say, I think all 15,000 would benefit from it. It's not to say that all 15,000 need the accessibility, but no one's going to be mad if there are really great captions on the video. No one's going to be upset if the audio quality is great. No one reading an article or a post is going to be frustrated that it's easy to skim and find the content you're looking for. So you have to kind of open your mind too and say, this isn't just for the people who need it. This is for the benefit of everyone who interacts with the content that I'm creating and working with.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I love that response, Joseph. Like, I think that's a great response, and I think sharing that is going to be really helpful for everyone. Thanks. I
Yeah,
love that.
absolutely. So thinking about all the different guidelines that you've been exposed to and maybe some of the common challenges that you see, whether it be headings, whether it be captions, I'm just curious if somebody today were listening and thinking to themselves, I don't do any accessibility at all. Do you have a favorite guideline or maybe principle that you would say, start with this today? What would be a good starting point for someone who doesn't do any accessibility now but wants to get started in their work today?
I want to pull up the course that I have, making online content accessible for all, because I actually start out with Perceivable, and Perceivable is the first one of the guidelines. But it's like, imagine you create a course or you create an e-learning module, and nobody can see it, nobody can read it, right? So I mean, so then that start there. Can they can they can they read it? Can they engage with it? Like, start with Perceivable. Did you see I posted the personas? So I would
Yes,
like
I
to
did see
mention
that
that.
post.
Okay, because that's making me think of that persona. There's the one where you go to the video and there's no sound and there's no caption. And it's just go there. If you haven't seen this yet and you're listening, maybe we could put it in the show notes. I don't.
Yeah,
I think, is that a
absolutely.
thing? Yeah. So and go to the personas, and I think it's either the first or second one. I'd have to pull it up. I don't have it in front of me. Maybe we could pull that up. But there's one where there's a video and it has no captions and no sound, and you're just looking at it and you're going, well, I'm not getting anything. Do that. Share that with someone who says,
Yeah.
I don't do accessibility. Like I don't make things accessible, which I find, I think you find more of people that say it's accessible enough. I feel like that we're more in that category versus that. Hopefully, maybe I'm optimistic, but it's more of it's accessible enough versus I don't do accessibility at all.
Yeah, I think that's a great distinction, that there's probably not people out there saying, I don't want to make anything accessible or I don't care. But yeah, is it accessible enough versus are we really taking the extra time and effort? And so, Nicole, I think this has really been super insightful to just think about how accessibility goes beyond just looking at guidelines, but like you mentioned, it's looking at the why of different accessibility principles. It's making sure we're using plain language so that content is understandable. We're thinking about, is my content perceivable? Can somebody look at this? Is it easy to see? Is it easy to read? Is it easy to understand? When we're taking the time to create videos, are we making sure that the captions are accurate? Are we making sure that they're accurate? And then you've talked about some really, really great tools like the Hemingway app. You've talked about other resources and websites. And so I'm curious, are there any resources or beginner tools that you would recommend somebody check out today to implement into their workflow?
Yeah, I'll give you the list and you can also put this in the show notes. I curated a list of, like I said, some basics, some free courses, some free tutorials, just things to get started, just to take a look at. Some are long, some are short, some are paid, some are free. People are welcome to, if they're feeling that they're a little you know, they're ready for the next step and they're a little bit, store have the basics down. I have the course. I offer a Making Online Content Accessible All course out of the Instructional Institute, which you and I were part of. And I'd join that. That's facilitated. I'll have a self-paced version coming out in June or July if people would prefer that as well. But yeah, I'll give you the list of curated resources and take a look at that. You can, I would say, follow the hashtag AllyA11Y on your social media feeds because people are posting things all the time. And so you could pick up a tool, pick up a tip. But I have said a couple of times that it's nice to have the tips and the tools and the resources for it to become part of the workflow is when it becomes something that you just do all the time. And so maybe you create all your e-learning projects and you have a post-it note at the end to do your alt text images. And I recommend if you do them at the end, it's better because, sometimes there's drafts and
Yeah.
sometimes there's changes, right? So if you just go into, if you're using Storyline, you open up your media library and you just do them all at the end, but have that workflow, have that in there that you do them and start with things like that. And there's and I also recently, if you go over to my LinkedIn, if you're watching, I posted I made it free if you don't have LinkedIn Learning. There's a nice articulate Storyline course right now that they developed, which is great to see for accessibility.
That's awesome. And I think that's really cool. So you mentioned you got a course coming out. People can follow you on LinkedIn, and it really is a reflective process. It sounds like applying accessibility. It's something we're doing throughout our work, but then also really honing in as we finish and thinking about, okay, let me go back through everything I did and really just double check. Am I meeting the accessibility guidelines online? And so if somebody wanted to follow your work and connect with you, where's the best place that they can do that? I know you mentioned LinkedIn is a great place to
Yeah.
follow you. Where do you recommend people go to keep up with you and everything that you're doing in the accessibility space?
That's probably it. That's what's like the really right now, that's it. I'll probably put out some things that I'll do presentations, or usually that's where I keep everything up to date. I have a newsletter, so I can put that out and share it if you want to get more targeted. I don't send you a ton of information. I just every once in a while updates on the next course or the next thing that's maybe I'm presenting somewhere and you want to attend. I could put that out. But I would also, just end with one other piece of advice is that um, be open to having feedback or having folks push you a little bit further and be okay with not being the full expert. Like, so be okay with someone saying, hey, I just looked at that and I think it could be better and here's why, and kind of drop the egos. And I think once we do that, then we can really get to the point where we're helping more people.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I will make sure to link your LinkedIn profile, your newsletter, and all of the amazing resources that you have shared with us today. It's been so insightful to hear and think about that journey. I think, Nicole, you and I are both runners. So when it comes to accessibility, it's definitely a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's not a 100-meter dash that I'm going to be accessible today and it's over in 10 seconds or less. But it really is this long-term journey of consistently working at it. And like you said, being vulnerable, being open to getting that feedback and learning and growing from those mistakes, from those challenges. So thank you
Yeah.
so much for really helping expand my understanding of accessibility, pointing me in the right direction, and sharing that with our listeners as well.
Yeah, well, I really enjoy talking with you. You know that. And anytime you want to talk, we could, I love everything you're doing. Your book club, if anybody's out there that hasn't joined Joseph's book club, it is fantastic. You should do that. And yeah, I look forward to more conversations. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in to Talk Learning with me. A huge thank you to Dr. Nicole L'Etoile for sharing her incredible insights on accessibility. Today, we explored how to incorporate accessibility into our workflows, why it's essential for everyone, and practical resources to help you get started. If you want to take your accessibility skills even further, be sure to check out Nicole's Making Online Content Accessible for All course. The next cohort kicks off on April 7th, and it's a fantastic way to learn how to design inclusive learning experiences. I'll drop the registration link in the show notes so you can sign up and continue growing in this important skill. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network, and we'll talk soon.